Second session of the BMF Conference 2008. My name is Sakina Kamwendo. I'm the host of Metro FM Talk, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here. I must just say that it would seem as though the more things change, the more they remain the same. I don't know why I always have to follow Given Unkari, but you know, that's a story for another day. So without much further ado, now that the politicians have departed the stage, we are going to try and get through this as smoothly as we possibly can so that we can open up the floor for discussion with yourselves. Now, our sub-theme for this segment is economic transformation, and seeing that Jimmy has asked me not to speak too much, I will proceed. And just before I call upon the first speaker, I want to frame this discussion with a quote from the Department of Trade and Industry's strategy document on economic transformation and Black economic empowerment. And I quote, "Apartheid systematically and purposefully restricted the majority of South Africans from meaningfully participating in the economy. The assets of millions of people were directly and indirectly destroyed, and access to skills and self-employment was racially restricted. The accumulation process under apartheid confined the creation of wealth to a racial minority and imposed underdevelopment on Black communities. The result is an economic structure that today, in essence, still excludes the vast majority of South Africans. It is therefore crucial to understand the magnitude of what took place in our past in order to understand why we need to act together as a nation to bring about economic transformation in the interest of all," unquote. Now, although the period since 1994 has seen some rigorous restructuring with regard to economic transformation, I think we all are in agreement that inequalities are still entrenched. But with that said, I'm now going to call on our first panelist, a man who needs absolutely no introduction, seeing that he is amongst his peers, is a former president of the BMF, and I will now call on Mr. Bheki Sibiya, who's going to address us on the impact of economic transformation on South Africans. Mr. Sibiya.
Program Director, thank you very much, and I would want to assure you why you always come after Given. It's an improvement. And Given knows that it's a given that he is excellent, but it is an improvement. Time and tide being what it is, Mr. President, Mr. Jimmy Manyi, the Deputy President, Sisnomhle board members, and please allow me to go through the protocol as a former president, the Managing Director, the Provincial Branch, student leadership members, friends of BMF, speakers, former president, if a lot who I saw is around, all protocol observed, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I would like to acknowledge especially the two colleagues with whom we are on the panel, Kuseni and Gill. And for me, I'm just a curtain raiser. The substance is going to come from them. And therefore, allow me, as I go through this rather quickly, it is because you will get substance from them. The subject which I've been given, it has been the impact of economic transformation on South African society. And that is the subject I'm going to quickly cover. Since we are a bit behind, if I go a bit fast like an announcer in the horse racing, you need to understand that I would like the horses to finish, as it were. The presentation outline, I would like to make a few introductory remarks, and after which I would like to say how has the economy been transformed. I will cover those few, and then cover some negative impact of economic transformation. I would say some, and therefore it's going to be few, and then say some positive impact of economic transformation, and then I would look at those being few as well and say some possible corrective measures, and those will be few, and then I will make concluding remarks, and I would like to focus on what will matter, as it were. There is an author who wrote, as I do my introductory remarks, who said, and I look at today and say it's so appropriate and so apt, Well, if it doesn't come strangely, I am going to read it for you. It says, it was the best of time. It was the worst of time. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was a season of light. It was a season of darkness. It was a spring of hope. It was a winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We're going direct to heaven. This person being afraid of hell. We're going direct the other way. In short, the period was far like the present period that some of the noisiest authorities insisted on it being received, for good or for evil, in the superlative degree, in comparison only. And that was a tale of two cities. And when one looks at politically, economically, South Africa, in a sense, it is a tale of two cities. And I will therefore not elaborate on those issues. But what has changed in terms of the economy? One, we have liberalized the economy. We have transformed, among others, the automotive sector, the textile sectors, and a lot of sectors have been changed by the Department of Trade and Industry. We have made the country foreign direct investment friendly, among others. We have introduced a number of legislation, effective and efficient tax collection, among other processes, Employment Equity Act, which we drove as BMF, Skills Development Act, Skills Development Levies Act, Broad-Based Black Economic Empowerment. Those acts, particularly Employment Equity and Broad-Based Black Economic Empowerment, BMF really played a significant role on those. Preferential Procurement Act, the BE Codes of Good Practice, Sector Empowerment Charters, and the National Credit Act, just to mention a few. When you look at those acts, and indeed the codes, they have had a significant impact in our economy. And therefore, allow me to get into some of the negative impacts which those have done. One, you may either call it jobless growth or limited jobs with the growth which has happened. And therefore, instead of staving off the unemployment, it has actually resulted in it continuing to be high. And some of the examples, extremely high levels of youth unemployment, which is currently standing at a whopping 65. I looked at it and I thought, it must be wrong. The lost generation, are we perpetuating the lost generation? One of the negative effects as well is very high levels of poverty, where 48% of the population live below the poverty datum line. That is when you look at 322 rand per month per person, as we had from Joel, or 10 rand 73 cents per person per day. And I'm sure in this room, none but none can live on 10 rand per day for a month. You would struggle for a day. But for us, we have 48% of the people who are living below that. And of course, we have the widening inequality gap, where we know that in 1995, the Gini coefficient was 60. In 2005, it stood at 65. When you look at that, it means South African society, as it were, has become more unequal, as it were, worsened, as it were, by 3%, 95 to 2005. Those are some of the negative impacts of the economic development and transformation which we have done. And I would not want to talk about the high levels of crime. We know about that. Now, what is happening? Am I in control? Please, may I be in control? I'm holding here what at some stage Cyril Ramaphosa said is a toy phone. And so I'm holding a dummy, and somebody here is actually doing the job somewhere else. Will you go back to some of the negative impacts of the economic transformation? Please. So the impact in terms of the implicit promotion of greed. For us, with our transformation, we have implicitly promoted greed. And that's why when one deals with the government officials, you find that they want their 2%, 5% or 10% in whatever preferential procurement tender that you have. For us, we need to say, let that be sorted out. We have serious cronyism on BEE, and hence the generally accepted issue of the usual suspects. And for us, we say it's a negative effect of the economic transformation which we have. I would be saying, notwithstanding the Asonge, Inzalo, and the other public retail issues, the failure to effectively broaden the BEE and seriously empower women. Those are some of the failures which we have heard about the economy and therefore the negative impacts. Let's get to the positive effects. I would love, though, to now move the slide, and it's going to hopefully move with me. From about 1% GDP growth at about 1993, we are now experiencing, and we continue to experience, the longest sustained economic growth in history of South Africa, exemplified by the GDP growth being averaging at 5% in the past 3 years, and it is expected that this year is going to be 3.8%. That is a positive impact. The implementation, albeit checkered, of broad-based black economic empowerment, and I think we may talk about that a bit later on. The implementation, again, albeit checkered, of the RDP houses, as it were. As we had, Joel again, 2.5 million RDP houses being built, and those housing 8.8 million people. That is excellent. May we give the government a round of applause, please? I know that General Bandu Olomisa is expected to come, and he doesn't like the RDP houses, because he says, as you sleep in the RDP house, your head is hitting the roof, and your knees are actually on your chest, or if you sleep, you find that your legs are protruding outside. But RDP houses are brick and mortar, and we need to say the government has done a good job where they are good jobs. Where they are not sustainable, they are going back, they are repairing it, as it were. In terms of successful implementation of the social grant, again, that has been covered, and it is a significant development. I won't talk to that because it has been covered. Marginal reduction of poverty. When one looks at it to say, using again that issue of 322 rand per person per month, we have moved from 53% of people who were below the poverty datum line to 48%, and therefore there is improvement which we need to acknowledge, and indeed it comes from the towards a 15-year review. Let me continue with some positive impacts, and I'm going to be moving towards rounding up, Program Director, so that you don't get too worried about me. The significant growth of what is called the black diamonds, and I know we hate the word black diamonds. I'm not so sure whether we like to be called Bappies, though, the black up and coming, or whether we want to call it guavas growing up and very ambitious. Whatever we call ourselves, this is growing very significantly to probably about 3 million individuals now. And when one looks at that, the expenditure of those people, however you define them, it's somewhere about 180 billion rand per annum. Compared to white people, why do we use white people as a standard of measure? It's because the economy is still largely dominated and driven by white people, and therefore they need to be a standard of measure. But when you look at that, we're going to overtake them before long in terms of it. And I'm going to cover as well to say what does that mean in other ways, as it were. Am I not pointing it in the right direction? In terms of, for the first time in history of this country, black people have mortgage bonds in numerical value, that is number of bonds, which are higher than those as well of white people. Then white people in terms of rent value is still higher, but in numerical terms, it actually talks a lot, and it is important for us to know that. And then in terms of the movement to the urban areas, we say conservatively 12,000 black families are leaving the black townships, moving into quote-unquote white suburbs. And that is significant. And when you note that it's black families as opposed to individuals, as it were, it has its own significance. And then when one looks at all those, they talk about the normalization or the integration of society, albeit starting in the suburbs, because that's where the guavas or the black diamonds are going, or the Bhekis, as it were. There is a normalization to the extent that you find that the cinemas, I love the movies, go to the schools, the churches, the parks, and even in the cemeteries, you are finding that the cemeteries are getting integrated. Because at some stage we were worried about the kind of the black ghosts and the white ghosts and that kind of thing. What are some of the possible measures that we may need to take? And I'm going to be a bit provocative here. I say we should agree with President Motlanthe that we review affirmative action. Mr. President, before you get worried, we need to review it to make it more effective, rather than less. My view is we need to review, if they want to review, the broad-based black economic empowerment to broaden it, because currently it is not broadened enough. We need to review the preferential procurement act in order to make it more effective. Let it not be preferential because it's cronyism, and therefore you prefer your relatives, you prefer your friends, you prefer the people who are going to give you kickbacks, but it has got to be preferring black people, women, and people with disability. We need to be saying, we must review the charters if we need to do that to adjust them upwards, but also to adjust them to the codes, as it were, because it's important. We need to ensure that the Presidential BE Advisory Council is effective. I'm not so sure how effective it is. If it really is in existence, it is not dead like the politics sometimes cause us to believe. We must ensure that the government enforcement agencies are made more effective. I would like here to pause and say, before he became the chairperson, we generally were very critical and we knew very little about the Employment Equity Commission. And Jimmy took that job with the scruff of its neck, shook it, and sometimes people disagreed with him, but he got the job done. May we give Jimmy a round of applause. My view is, in terms of the development of financial institutions, at a national level, provincial level, we need to say, let them do a better job. They can do a better job. I think for me, it is a shame. It's an embarrassment where a person who is a first-time BEE transaction maker is going to find better reception at ABSA, FNB, Investec, Nedbank, Standard Bank than at the IDC, NEF, Umsobomvu, Eastern Cape Development Corporation, Itala or MIG. It is plain wrong. Wrong and wrong. And therefore, let me wrap up. As I wrap up, you may say, what shall we do then? I'll be saying, as we look at ourselves, let's turn and kind of look in the mirror. What can we do? Comparable to Theo Botha, who said, as the president did, ask not what America will do for you, but ask what you will do for America. I have this, and I don't want to make it a complicated exercise. However, it says what will matter. When you look at it, it says ready or not. Someday it will all come to an end. There will be no more sunrises, no minutes, no hours or days. All things you collected, whether treasured or forgotten, will pass to someone else. Your wealth, fame, and temporal power will shrivel to irrelevance. It will not matter what you owned or what you owed. Your grudges, your resentment, your frustrations, your jealousies, will finally disappear. So too your hopes, ambitions, plans, to-do lists will expire. The wins and the losses that once seemed so important to you will fade away. It won't matter where you came from or what side of the tracks you lived at the end. It will not matter whether you are beautiful or brilliant. Even the gender or your skin color will be irrelevant. So what then will matter? How will our value be measured? What will matter is not what you bought, but what you built. Not what you got, but what you gave. Not what will matter is not your success, but your significance. What will matter is not what you learned, but what you taught. What will matter is every act of integrity, compassion, courage, sacrifice that enrich, empowered, encourage others to emulate your example. What will matter is not your competence, but your character. What will matter is not how many people you knew, but how many people who feel a lasting loss when you are gone. What will matter is not your memories, but the memories of those who love you. What will matter is not how you will be remembered by whom and for what. Living a life that matters does not happen by accident. It's not a matter of circumstance, but choice. Choose a life that matters. My view is we need to choose a life that matters and will make a difference. And here, I think, to end on a humorous note, I attended the meeting where Mr. Robert Gumede said, you know, Mr. President, talking to Jacob Zuma, before 1994, we used to have a six-pack. And I would say, ladies, look from the waist up. And gentlemen, too. But then he says, post the 1994, we have developed the patriotic funds. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sibiya. I must say, I'm just so grateful that you chose to show a picture of a man as opposed to that of a woman. But from there, we're moving straight along. Our next speaker, Mr. Kuseni Dlamini, and of course, very important speaker, because we cannot talk about transformation in this country without talking about Anglo-American. And Mr. Dlamini is the head of Anglo-American South Africa, and he's going to be focusing on foreign investor perspective on the political leadership transition. Mr. Dlamini.
Thank you, Program Director. President of the BMF, past presidents, I understand Mr. Lord Ndlovu might be here with us. He was indeed here this morning. Bheki Sibiya, another stalwart of the BMF, Deputy President of the BMF, the Managing Director of the BMF. Now we've got leaders of the BMF from different provinces and different cities and towns, and of course the student chapter of the BMF. Fellow panelists, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it is a privilege and a great honor indeed for me to participate in this prestigious and important Black Management Forum's annual conference. I would like to commend the BMF for their outstanding work in organizing such successful conferences for the past 28 years. These conferences are crucial as they seek to probe important political, economic and developmental issues affecting our country. May the organization grow from strength to strength and continue with its sterling work. The BMF has been an important thought leadership forum in the context of South Africa. I would like to argue that there is a bigger space to be occupied in global thought leadership. What we see is a chronic and acute deficit of Black management leadership in FTSE 100 companies, Fortune 100 companies. I think the challenge facing this country, if it is to play a meaningful role in global affairs, is to have a critical mass of world-class corporate executives that are going to take their rightful places in the leading corporations of the world. Ladies and gentlemen, I've been asked to give a short analytical view on the topic on foreign investor perceptions of the current leadership transition that we are all going through in South Africa. I want to locate my conversation, very short conversation, I hope it will be this morning with you, within the context of looking at how does the political transition impact on the global economic landscape. However, given the recent most significant developments witnessed in the post-democratic, post-apartheid South Africa, whereby the state president, Thabo Mbeki, was recalled, as we know, recently from office before his term expired, I thought of modifying the topic slightly and give a short analysis looking at how does enforced political leadership transition impact on the global perceptions of South Africa. I would like to argue this morning that the enforced political transition, like the one that we've just witnessed in South Africa, is a normal, common global phenomenon, cutting across both first world and developing countries. Therefore, we should not panic and think that South Africa is an anomaly in this situation. As a matter of fact, so far, former President Nelson Mandela is the only head of state in both pre- and post-apartheid South Africa to gracefully leave the highest office in the land without any drama of being forced to resign or otherwise. 9 former heads of state in South Africa preceding Mandela and Bheki either died in office or left disillusioned, bitter, and humiliated, thus triggering an enforced political leadership transition, like the one we've recently seen. I will support my argument, ladies and gentlemen, by reviewing previous enforced political transitions in both pre- and post-apartheid South Africa, and also draw on examples from 2 first world countries, the United States of America and Italy, and also look at a few developing country examples. If one now looks at the history of enforced political transitions in South Africa, an interesting and similar pattern emerges. Let's go back to 1919. Look at Louis Botha. The former commander of the Boer forces in the South African War, General Louis Botha, became the first Prime Minister of the Union of South Africa in 1910. He came under fire from the British and Afrikaner hotheads in his cabinet of national reconciliation. He had to deal with a fellow Boer general, Barry Hertzog, who broke away and formed the National Party. Louis Botha had to put down a rebellion involving his wartime comrades against his decision to side with the British in the First World War. By the time he returned from the Versailles Peace Conference of 1919, he was seriously ill and died while still in office. Let's go on to Barry Hertzog. During the Second World War in 1939, Barry Hertzog, who was then the first nationalist prime minister, departed the highest office, a broken, bitter man, forsaken by his old nationalist compatriots after being outvoted by his then deputy, General Jan Smuts, in favor of joining the war effort on the side of the British. Jan Smuts, like former President Thabo Mbeki, strode the world and some would say kept his eye off the ball and neglected the domestic developments and resentment that was growing against him back home. He was more shocked and humiliated by his United Party's defeat at the polls in 1948 by the Apartheid National Party led by D.F. Malan. D.F. Malan was in turn forced to retire due to old age in 1954. He was age 80. He had wanted Classy Havnecha, considered to be someone of less racist persuasion, to succeed him as Prime Minister. However, the racist extremist succeeded in securing the election of J.G. Strydom, who was the nationalist leader of the then Transvaal. Strydom was not to last in the highest office, as he died 4 years later in 1958 while still holding office. The main architect of apartheid, Hendrik Verwoerd, took over from J.G. Strydom, and he too left the office in a coffin when on the 6th November 1966, while the assembly bells were ringing before the day's business, a parliamentary messenger, Dimitri Tsefandes, fatally stabbed him. Verwoerd's successor, John Vorster, was besieged by faction fighting inside the National Party and by mounting international pressure. He was caught up in what became known as the Malagate scandal, when his Minister of Information, Connie Mulder, lied to Parliament and denied that the nationalist government was funding the Citizen newspaper. He was pressurized by his successor, P.W. Botha, to become a non-executive president, and he eventually left office a broken, lonely figure after securing the National Party the biggest election victory 2 years earlier. P.W. Botha, under international pressure and the country drifting into anarchy, realized that apartheid would not work and started dismantling it. However, he was not bold enough to enter into meaningful negotiations with the leaders of the banned liberation movements at the time. His reform stalled, and his once loyal cabinet voted for him to leave office. He too departed a bitter, lonely man. P.W. Botha's successor, F.W. de Klerk, under intense international pressure and continued international isolation of South Africa, proceeded to unban the liberation movements and released their leaders from prison, including Nelson Mandela. This political move earned him a Nobel Prize that he shared with Mandela, as we all know. He led the National Party to a negotiated settlement with the African National Congress and other liberation movements, and served as one of 2 deputy presidents under President Mandela. However, in 1996, he resigned from the government of national unity and left a disillusioned figure, and some would say he remains so to some extent today. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you will agree with me that the highest office in the land is very hot indeed. Current and future leaders to occupy that office better learn from history and their predecessors that their fortune might change any time without a warning. Globally, they have been enforced political transitions that should be a lesson for us all. If one looks at the United States of America, which is considered by many to be the world's best democracy, the reference point, the yardstick that we should all aspire towards in terms of democratic values, it is common knowledge that on August 5, 1974, then President Richard Nixon was forced to resign from the White House following a series of major scandals involving corruption, illegality of wiretapping, forced breaking into the Democratic Party headquarters, and deceit displayed by those within his administration in what was famously the Watergate scandal. Nixon was forced to resign in the face of likely impeachment. Nixon was then replaced by Gerald Ford, who later pardoned him for any federal crimes that he may have committed while in office. If one looks at Italy, ladies and gentlemen, if there was such a thing as the World Cup of enforced political transitions and the collapse of government, Italy will definitely be the undisputed world champions. As indeed, they are currently the FIFA Soccer World Cup champions. They have 2 World Cups. The 2 protagonists that have dominated the Italian political scene over the last decade in a yo-yo-like fashion have largely been the current Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi and the former Prime Minister Romano Prodi. It's really been a sort of a game of cat and mouse between the 2 of them. And since peacetime, since the end of the Second World War, Italy has not really had effective and orderly transitions that have happened 3 times in consecutive terms. Looking at developing countries, Brazil is a good example, a country that I've just returned from this morning. Developing countries are also not immune from enforced political transitions. In Brazil, the former president, Fernando Collor, became the first president to be impeached due to corruption. He was forced to resign on 29 December 1992 following accusations by his brother Pedro Collor that he was running a peddling scheme in which he confiscated money from bank accounts from people and froze their savings accounts. Many Brazilians viewed this as a violation of their civil rights, and his political rights were suspended for 8 years. We've just seen what happened in Pakistan recently. We've just seen also what happened in the United Kingdom when Gordon Brown took over the keys to number 10 Downing Street from Tony Blair. Blair left at a very low note compared to when he took over the leadership of the Labour Party in the country in 1997. What then, ladies and gentlemen, is the impact of all this? In attempting to answer this question, my argument would be that it depends on whether the transition is triggered internally by the same ruling party that the head of state belongs to, or it is triggered by the rival opposition party. If it is triggered by the same ruling party, I'd like to suggest the likelihood of the policy direction changing drastically is minimal, and the impact on the economy will also not be severe. However, if it is triggered by the rival opposition party, then there is a likelihood that there would be major political shifts and the impacts on the economy may not necessarily be predictable. If one looks at the case of Richard Nixon in the US, the political transition was triggered within the Republicans. Even though Nixon was a conservative Republican, he was widely seen from a policy point of view as a centrist or a liberal. He ushered a new era of peaceful coexistence with the then Soviet Union, and indeed he was very much visionary in terms of realizing the importance of China at the time when many leaders did not do so. Nixon largely governed in accordance with the Canadian modern liberal principles on domestic issues, especially fiscal policy. As president, he imposed wage and price controls. He also imposed indexed social security for inflation and created supplementary security income. He also had plans to create a universal minimum income and universal health care, but was not able to realize either due to the fact that he was forced to leave office. Nixon was succeeded by his fellow Republican, Gerald Ford, who also largely governed in accordance with the Canadian liberal economic principles. During his tenure, the US economy suffered from inflation and the country sank into a mild recession, forcing him to sign into law income tax rebates as part of the Tax Reduction Act of 1975 to boost the economy. Again, in Italy, we've seen the changes have involved a transfer of power from one party to the other, with far-reaching changes in economic and foreign policy. Romano Prodi was very key in taking Italy to the Eurozone, which was launched in the beginning of 2002. And we know that Silvio Berlusconi has largely been a Tory-like leader and very much conservative. So that's a very good example of change, enforced transition of leadership that happens between parties and the impact that it has on policies. Coming back to South Africa, ladies and gentlemen, in South Africa, all the enforced political transitions from DF Malan to FW de Klerk were engineered from the inside by their National Party colleagues. Because the changes were triggered by personalities rather than a fundamental change in philosophy and ideology, they all implemented racial segregation policies with dire economic consequences, which resulted in South Africa's continued international isolation. When Mandela replaced de Klerk in a peaceful and democratic transition, there was a fundamental shift on political and economic policies that saw the abolition of apartheid and the steering of the country towards democracy and sustained economic growth and development. Mandela and the African National Congress moved away from the nationalization of the commanding heights of the economy as envisaged in the Freedom Charter and adopted the so-called mixed economy policies, which saw the implementation of the RDP. The RDP was aimed at redressing the economic imbalances of the past by redistributing wealth to previously disadvantaged South Africans. Mandela gracefully left office after serving only one term and was democratically replaced by Bheki, who, much to the chagrin of the Tripartite Alliance partners, COSATU and the SACP, I understand Comrade Blade was here this morning, abandoned the RDP in favor of the GEAR strategy aimed at reducing the fiscal deficit. Many saw GEAR as a neoliberal policy, and its results show a mixed performance. The two main disappointments of GEAR were job growth and investment. The target for job growth was 2.9% growth in informal non-agricultural employment per year. Jobs grew at about 2.5% in the period 1995 to 2003, but more than half of these jobs were in the informal sector. Investment performance was even more disappointing. Investment by private, parastatal and public sectors all shrank instead of growing at around the 10% per annum which was required. Growth, not surprisingly, was also averaging between 2.6 over the GEAR period instead of the projected 4.2%. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to conclude now because we are running out of time. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, I sought to argue in my presentation today that enforced political leadership transition is a common occurrence globally. And I cited examples from the United States, Italy, Brazil, Pakistan. I highlighted the fact that South Africa has long been subjected to enforced political transition, and that Nelson Mandela is the only former head of state to leave the office gracefully without being forced to resign or otherwise. I further argued that the economic impact of a forced political transition depends on whether the transition is triggered from within the same ruling party as the removed head of state or by the rival opposition party. If it is from within, then there is a likelihood that there will be minor policy shifts and the impact on the economy will be minimal. And indeed, if indeed major policy shifts take place, it doesn't mean that they should not take place. They will be within the context of the very same framework that the party has been propagating. However, if the transition is enforced by the rival opposition, then we can expect major policy shifts and serious impact on the economy, either for the better or for the worse. As the saying goes, the only constant thing is change itself. We should not be afraid of change or transition, ladies and gentlemen, but rather be concerned with how the transition is effected. The decisive, calm way the current transition in the South African political landscape has been handled inspires confidence that the country is still on the right course, and we should all rally behind this change to make South Africa a stable, globally competitive, winning nation, free of poverty, ignorance, and disease. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Mr. Dlamini. And then, without much further ado, last but by no means least, our final speaker on this panel, it's Ms. Gill Marcus, and Professor Gill Marcus, I should say rather, and she is the chairperson of the APSA group, and she's going to be talking to us about the role of all South Africans to ensure that transformation actually does take place. I don't know if it's on.
Thank you, and to the leadership of BMF. I think you have a conference that you've convened at the most appropriate time, both globally and domestically. I'd like to touch on a couple of things for a start. The world is not the same as it was even a week ago. I think we are in the most grave situation, both politically and economically, in living memory. The current circumstance is referred to as similar to the Great Depression, and that's become common in the discussions around what we are experiencing. But the big difference, of course, between now and obviously some of the details around it, but the big difference, of course, is that we now have a globalized world. And therefore, the issues that originated in the United States have now begun to touch every part of the globe. The second element of this is that we are also in very trying political times. If we look at the global situation, we have a world in which the definition of the other has taken particular proportions, in particular a focus on terrorism and Muslim, as if they are the same, which we all know they are not. Within that context, war has been prevalent in quite a number of countries. Iraq and Afghanistan are but two. And if we look at history, we do know that when you have economic downturns of such magnitude that result in desperation among ordinary people, one of the consequences that has arisen has been war and conflict. And therefore, at a time of change of leadership, which is happening in the United States, it is happening in many parts of the world, it is, whether it is internal, such as with ourselves, or within the UK, a time of great turbulence and great uncertainty. Within that context, let us look at ourselves and ask, what are the kind of things that we also need to take into account? One of the things that I would like to talk about a little bit also is that how societies function. When you have such times of uncertainty, what occurs generally is that we all gravitate to what we know best. And therefore, our identity is reduced to what we know and who we know. We are more secure in our own circle, if you like. And therefore, we create an even greater stress between our identity as to who we are and the them and us scenarios, which has its own damages in a society that is in the kind of turmoil we are in the globe at the moment. This question of a narrow identity is extremely important for us as South Africans to look at, because the narrower the identity, the less we're able to build bridges. And the question of how societies and the hallmarks of successful countries are around an alignment of an overarching common purpose. If we think back ourselves, 94, 99, in the years that we have had coming to where we are now, one of the things that has bound us together is a sense of a common future that we would like to co-determine. We've succeeded in some areas better than others, but we've had that overarching, if you like, glue with the Freedom Charter, with what we see as our country. It's that bringing together, that alignment of an overarching framework that is so important. Within that, we of course have differences of view, but a successful country will create partnerships within that alignment. The partnerships between government and the private sector, the partnership that is essential with civil society, a partnership that looks at the common good, that we act in the interests of the common good and not just in own interests. And within that, we also need to recognize both the formal and the informal. The formal is the rules we create by which we function, the employment equity, the targets that we set in terms of the codes of good practice for transformation. Those are the rules. What we also need to better understand is what are the norms. What are the things that we actually go by, which is the informal. Just think about any organization that any of us are part of. If you post a notice, or however you post it today, intranet or otherwise, how many people look at it? You'll find that that is usually not very well, it's not a very good means of communication. But just have something you don't want everybody to know, right? It's through that organization in 1 second, because of the informal way communication works, because of the relationships that are there. And a lot of those informal things relate to our assumptions. And when we talk about society and transformation, the one thing we are not tackling in the way we interact is our assumptions. First of all, our assumptions of each other, our assumptions of South Africa, our assumptions of what we mean by and what we see. So that if we look at transformation and we look at black women, what are the assumptions that those black women have to deal with without them even knowing what they are, that are made about a black woman or women in general? The assumptions in our society are very deep-rooted because of our past. And therefore, part of transformation is that personal change that's necessary, but also to address the assumptions of how we see, and to tackle those more vigorously than we do. Because we're tackling, in many ways, the things that we can identify, the things that we can quantify, but we're not tackling the things that lie behind it that make it more difficult. And those are our assumptions about what is skill, who has skill, how do we see. The second thing that I would like to deal with in relation to transformation, and that is the question of leadership. It's been referred to by my fellow panelists both now and earlier. But the one thing that I don't feel that we deal with on the leadership side sufficiently is that most people, on average, every one of us, has a relative level of fearfulness. We like familiarity. We like what we know. The task of leadership in certain and uncertain times, but in particular when you've got such big challenges to overcome as we have, is to recognize people's fears and help people find the way through the fear to the goal that you're trying to achieve. So that you work with people to manage those fears going forward. Bad leadership plays on the fears, exploits the fears, creates them as insurmountable. And unfortunately today, I think we have much more example of the latter than the former. And that is a challenge for every one of us, because every one of us in this room has a sphere of influence within which we are leaders. And it's how we exercise that leadership with that sense of alignment, of commonality, of purpose, of recognizing the fears that people have, not to pander to them, but to work your way through those fears for the greater good and the goal, and not to exploit and manipulate those fears. And I think that's an enormous challenge. If I had to give an example that I think was, to me, if we looked at 9/11, a terrible disaster that occurred in the United States, but one in which the fears, the genuine fears of people were manipulated to the point where they could agree to go into Iraq on the basis of weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist. But you got there because you manipulated people's fears. I also think that in terms of transformation, as much as we have goals that are legitimate, aspirational, committed to, we need to recognize and examine quite critically why we haven't got there. And I think that it's come up a number of times. It came up when Joel was presenting earlier. But for me, one of the core issues remains the question of education. Education is not something that it's not about what we spend, and it's not about whether we berate this teacher or that teacher. I think that as a question of a society, do we as a society value education? Is it something that's intrinsic to what our sense of ourselves as South Africans are? That we want to be an educated society? And I'm not sure that is the case. I think that in many ways we're a society that values a certificate more than we value the content and the knowledge that we need. And within that, if we do not address education from the ground up, I think that the level of the kids coming out today it's not a question of whether we are going to succeed. We cannot have a society in today's world in which the potential of people is undervalued, underreached, because the base that they have been given in our society is inadequate. And it is that thirst and the search for knowledge is so important. It is not just about the teacher's role. It's about our societal role and the things that we value and we build into what we want to stand for. In the time that's remaining to me, I want to deal with two things. What is the big challenge that we face if we look at the world? We've got so many. If you looked at us at the conversation we are having, if I listen to the news, I'm not saying they're not important. Believe me, I think they're extremely important discussions that we're having. But the big question that we have to look at, that is going to challenge us as South Africa and our role in the region, relate to two issues. One, energy, and two, food. Would you agree? Yes. That is long-term thinking. Joel, when he presents the 15-year review, talks about 2014 goals. Well, they may be goals and they may not, but that's around the corner. If we want to deal with food security, we can't take a 3 or a 5-year horizon. We've got to take a much longer horizon than that. And the challenge for us is energy. We may be looking at pebble bed, that's fine, but the question for me is if we as South Africa recognize the role and the influence we can play on the continent and in our region. We are not, what do we have that other countries and continents don't have? We have enormous land value. We have the resource. Where South Africa is a drought-prone country, but the region is not necessarily. And within our region as a whole, there's no question that we can look at, if we had a long-term plan, that we understood both what we need to do now, how that will build to the future for food security. It is an absolute imperative for us, and it addresses so many of our other issues. If we deal with food security, we will deal with land tenure, and we will deal with land transformation, and we will deal with restoration. It is no good having land transformation and land restoration to people that does not support them to make that land viable and to have that as successful. Land transformation in this country cannot be a failure. It is a travesty if it is a failure, but that means that we need to give the support that when we transfer land, for what purpose and how is it sustaining? And if we look at the region, we need to do the same, because if we look at the region in long term, we can become the breadbasket. If we understand that, we look at what it would take to be the breadbasket. What infrastructure is required, what energy resource, what water, what skills. And in that sense, today agriculture is not going out and tending some cattle. Today agriculture is high-tech. It is something that is so scientifically based that we can actually transform not only the resource that we create, its sustainability, but the knowledge that we need to be successful in the agricultural sphere. And I'm using agriculture in the broader sense. And this is something that if we have as an idea, let's take it forward as a country and let's knock it into shape. What would it actually mean to do that? If we do not, what is the consequence of food shortage in our region? Yeah. Domestically, at this point in time, we have poor people who may not be able to afford the food, but the food is there, right? It's a pricing question. Imagine if there isn't food, irrespective of price. We just need to look north of the border and look at the consequence for us if that becomes a regional question. This is an imperative. I don't think we have a choice. We need to hammer out what we do. And your voice, your role as the BMF, and as South Africans as a whole, but in particular, Black South Africans, because this is how we also will transform the relationships we have, urban, rural, joblessness, skills, all of those areas. It's one element. I'm not saying there are not others, there are plenty, but I'm putting that on the table as probably one of the most crucial over the next few years to do something about before it is late. The second thing is broad-based BEE. A lot has been said and I'm not going to go over that. But I would like to just put forward a thought. Okay? It may be totally unrealistic. What is one of the things that came up in Joel's presentation? We all know it. What is one of the things that we have as a major hindrance to the way we go forward? Effective local government. That is the cutting edge between citizens, isn't it? Can you imagine if broad-based BEE was a partnership with local government, where the revenue stream of what that broad-based meant went into local government, where the companies that actually were part and parcel of that looked at the skill resource required for local government, so that when you have somebody who's at the moment you're looking at and saying, you need to retire, or you want to do CSI, or you want to do something else, you have a clear partnership. You partnership local authorities, and with a revenue stream. Is that not something that could be explored, so that when we look at broad-based, it's defined because the beneficiaries are all the people who live there. And if you have a resource going, especially in the smaller areas, especially in rural areas, if you have a resource, R1 million in a small village is a fortune. It's a drop in the ocean in a big city. But if you have that revenue stream, and you have the partnership that enables skill, and you build that into the kind of sustainable broad-based BEE for the betterment of citizens that is accountable, and the companies become accountable to where they operate as well. I think the relationships we would have are different. I think the enrichment would be different, and the benefits to citizens would be enormous. I think these are the kinds of areas when as we look forward, learning the lessons of where we've been, there are many ways in which we can significantly improve in terms of that common good. And in that conclusion, I think the challenge that we have as South Africans is actually to find each other, to look at the ways in which we cross the great divides, that we do not create new ones, and that we find ways in which, for the transformation to be meaningful, the society at its root must change. And that means people have the practice of what we have in our Bill of Rights and in our Constitution have to stop being paper and become reality for ordinary South Africans. Thank you.
Thanks to Professor Marcus. And I think nobody said it was going to be easy. But it's about time that we started asking the more difficult questions. And now that we've heard the assertions of the panel, we're going to move on and open the discussion to the floor and take questions from you. But if I may just start by abusing my position and asking a question first. And to Professor Marcus, you asked, why haven't we got there yet? And a lot has been said about the sluggish pace of transformation, especially economic transformation in this country. But who is the main driver of transformation? Is it government or is it market forces?
I don't think it's either. I think it's citizens. I think if you leave this to government, government can create a framework. Government should help us set goals about what we want to do. Government must create the enabling environment. Market forces, as we've seen at the moment, are rather something that we leave to market forces. I actually think it is the citizens of this society, and I don't think we've put enough emphasis on the role every one of us play. It's what we expect. If we look at transformation, for me, if we look at education, we look at the teachers and we look at it and we say, what is happening? But if I had to ask every one of us in this room, is there a role that we could play differently? What are the things that we could do in our organizations or as individuals? And when we talk about organizations, it's not just the formal organizations, say, like the BMF, but people are on parent-teacher associations, we have sporting clubs, we have all kinds of things. And transformation is about how we use our sphere of influence to change and make a difference. And part of it also, I think, is to be much more intolerant of mediocrity. We accept mediocrity as normal, and that for me is a hindrance to transformation. If we look at it, and I don't know where this comes from, because it's almost a looking down upon the black kids of today. If you know 4 out of 10 things you've got, you're given a pass, you've done wonderfully. You don't know 6 out of 10. But why is that good enough? It's because we've accepted a lesser level. And I think that's part of our mindset. If we do not accept that, if we expect our kids, black, white, pink or green, to perform to the level that we want them to, we will not tolerate or make excuses. And I think we've created a situation in which, because of our mindsets, we've accepted less as okay. And I don't think that is a reflection on the talent of the children of the society or of the adults of the society.
And you will forgive me, especially people sitting here, and that the lights are shining directly into my eyes if I don't see you. But I think we have a gentleman in the second row from the back. Yes, you, sir. Yes.
Thank you, Prof. The name is Mashilo. Taking into account the importance of transformation in the banking sector and the production of means of production by the black people, how would you relate to a recent case now between ABSA, NAFCOC, and BMF? Your comment, please. I'm aware the matter is sub judice, but I would like to hear how will you comment on that.
Bheki and I at the start of this agreed that this wasn't a subject for here. I think it is something that is being considered, and all I would urge is we need to find a resolution of that issue in the best interests of the people who are banking with League. And I think that is absolutely, certainly happy and open to discussions around it. It is sub judice. Beyond that, I don't think we can go into it here. But it is something that both BMF and ourselves, and the previous, Wiseman and Kulu's been involved, everyone's been involved in trying to find a resolution to this. It needs to be done expeditiously. But if I could perhaps, trying to give a sense of the transformation in banking, because part of my earlier answer did not address the role of corporates, and I think corporates have a particular responsibility, both in terms of the training and the opportunities and the employment, but also in the way they see. If a bank understands the needs of our society adequately, it needs to find ways to be relevant to those needs. It doesn't mean to say that you take undue risk or that you don't recognize all the rules and obligations and regulations that are there. But there are ways of doing business as a bank that can be much more relevant to the transformation need, not just of your employment or your CSI, but of the society that you serve. And I think that's an area that certainly we are exploring very vigorously, because I think there's an enormous amount that we can do better there. And I think it's something not just for a bank, but for all corporates. But banks in particular, I think, have a role in relation to the society and the relevance to society today that is very, very important.
Thank you. Can't see in front here.
My name is Mahal from BMF Borbella. I want to ask you, Prof, about you mentioned education as being very key to transformation. Now, there was an article in the media about free education. Do you believe that free education is actually going to give us an opportunity to truly drive transformation as we need?
The issue of education, Mr. Sibiya. The role that education plays.
I do agree fully with Professor Marcus about the importance of education. And periodically I quote my favorite son of the soil, Madiba, who, when he wrote his book, Long Walk to Freedom, he says education is a great engine of personal development, and he continues with it about how important it is, irrespective of the background which we come from. I think the disappointment which I personally have in us transforming the economy is sometimes the role which the government officials don't play. They sit on the chairs, they warm the chairs without delivering, and for us we applaud for them as if they have done a wonderful job. And I'm not wanting to necessarily exaggerate the role of them. However, when one looks at the resources, as a private sector, if I become a rabid marketeer, I say if the company is producing goods and services, it's selling them at a fair price and is doing its CSI and is paying its taxes, let the government do its job. For us, the shame in South Africa is that we have poor education, not because we don't have money, but because money is being misused. We have poor education not because we don't have teachers, however, because our minister or the Director General at a national level, or the MECs or the HODs at the provincial level, or the circuit inspectors are not engaging with the teachers well enough. And so for the private sector, I think it plays its role, but it tends to be very hodgepodge because it is incidental to what they do. Yes, in terms of the private sector, it needs to be blamed very seriously. To say we have the National Skills Development Act, and sometimes we play kind of shortcuts in terms of skills development. We need to develop the skills, and therefore the private sector needs to do that. However, we need to bend this branch whilst it is still soft. When people are already old and we need to give them the adult basic education, it is already too late. However, late is better than never, and therefore we need to challenge ourselves here in the room when we have authority in the companies where we are to say, what are we really doing about skills development? To say the foundation of education may be shaky, however, if we reinforce it appropriately with education, I think we can do wonderful jobs. And for us who play roles in the sector education and training authorities, especially their governing councils, as well, we need to do our jobs. Sometimes we sit there as well and we warm the chairs, as it were, instead of taking the leadership and say, this sitter is going to be successful. That's why we hear the Minister of Labour sometimes talks about the sitters being the bad, the good, and the ugly, to find that the good are few, the bad and the ugly are many. And somehow we, in this room, are responsible for that, because we are sitting in those councils and we are not providing the leadership that is required. I agree with Professor Marcus. Leadership makes a difference. We need to, as we say our motto, developing managerial leadership. We need to not only develop it, but implement it in our workplaces.
I think for now we're going to take 3 questions. We've got Two ladies at the back there, and then a gentleman next to the door.
Hi, I have an open question to the panel, though I don't believe in open letters. The question I have, the number of speakers have been saying to us, Jimmy, BMF should respond to these issues, what's happening in the rural development issues, all other issues that are affecting our society. I just have a question in the recent development to say, how does BMF respond when people are serving divorce papers?
Okay, and then we've got two ladies at the back. Noted.
Thank you, Chair. I think at this section on economic transformation was just the right people. And I'm starting my question with, I really believe, oh, by the way, I'm Laura Machava Abiyoden from Protector Partner. I really believe that we have some of the best strategies, best policies, best governance, best constitution in the world in South Africa. We even sit and chair the governance committee. And when I look at the discussions we just had around the impact of economic transformation, foreign investors' view on what's happening currently, and lastly, the role of South Africans to ensure, the key here is about action, which is what leadership is about. It's about taking a stand. It's about drawing a line. And like Sibiya said, it's about just that character of takeoff. What you're going to leave behind, the legacy. My question to the panel and to us in the room to reflect on is, we are sitting in a historical timeline. We have an opportunity to make a lasting difference. When it comes to us, I'm going to use myself and my partner here as an example. We are in the financial industry, running a 15 million rand business, 90% women. The challenge with leadership is for the civic society to actively enter and make a difference. As you knock in the door, somebody must open and respond. And if there's no response from the people on the other side, and we never give up, we continue, how does this leadership in action happen to redefine the landscape so people don't leave South Africa and say it's not going to happen? Number two, we go beyond being the best thought leaders to being the best in action, because we just demonstrated it in 1994. What is it that we can do? Because we have begun, and I want to challenge each one of us, whether we're the Guagas or the Barbies or the Black Diamonds or no name, where you sit, what is it that you're doing daily on those boards, in your role, employed or self-employed, to make a difference?
Thank you. There's a gentleman in the blue shirt here. Sir, noted. Noacha.
Thank you. The name is Bonga Zungu from KwaZulu-Natal. Mine is a very quick one. Against the background of slow pace of transformation, I do note that some of the things that we transform in our country do happen fast. I need some comfort, maybe to remind you. In terms of the debate about the Chinese being referred to as black within the triple BE phenomenon, where is the debate currently? How can we improve the situation for all of us as fast as it was done in the Chinese thing?
Thank you. Mr. Manyi, we'll start with you. 2 questions there directed at you. Firstly, the one about the divorce papers that are being served.
I see that gentleman also get us into trouble. Yeah. Okay, 2 issues. First, I think before that, you said something about rural development, etc., etc. We've just agreed as a BMF in our AGM that one of the things that we want to do is to plow back much more than we've been doing. We want to put back social capital into the townships. We resolve that there will be a BMF branch in every township. So that would include rural areas. We're going to look for opportunities. What are the key issues in those rural areas? What are the key issues in those townships? And we're going to mobilize on those issues and create BMF structures all over. In terms of the divorce papers, the BMF is applying its mind. In terms of the Chinese, on the Chinese question, I think in terms of where the debate is now, I can only summarize it and say the horse has not only bolted, but it has left the stable. We just have to accept the situation. The situation is simply that there's 10,000 South African Chinese, but their economic active population is something like 2,500 in a population of 46 odd million people. If we would be able to contain it and not have a situation where the 2,500 becomes a front for the whole Beijing. If we'll be able to contain it, then I think let's just move on with life and not complicate things. But I think the challenge is to make sure that 2,500 rate does not become a front. I think...
And I want to put the next question to Mr. Dlamini. The challenge that was issued by the lady there about what we are doing, each one of us, our individual role. And if I may perhaps just add to that, if we look at the specific contribution of BEE in, for instance, turning around the huge tide of unemployment.
Thanks, Program Director. I think that's a very important question. Each one of us have got a very important and critical role to play. I can just mention from our point of view at Anglo, transformation is something that we've been doing over the years, even before there were charters in the mining industry and in other sectors of South Africa. Last year we concluded deals that are worth 50 billion rand. When we look at our management ranks today, we're at 44% HDSA. We know we've made some progress, but we are aware that there's still challenges to change the demographics of Anglo-American. In terms of access for businesses like yours, Laura, I think it's the kind of mutually beneficial partnership that companies like ours, and indeed I dare say other big companies elsewhere in South Africa, would find very exciting, and it's the kind of thing that I would not think that it makes business sense to close one's door. If anything, we are opening our doors and saying who are the kind of partners that can assist us with this or that service or this or that product that we need for our operations. I think we've moved beyond the era of resisting transformation to an era where we are realizing it's a very competitive landscape out there. To find good partners is a challenge, and to find appropriate suppliers is a challenge that companies are grappling with and want to make a lot of progress on. We've got very stretched targets and very stretched key performance indicators that we set for our managers to achieve in that area. So I don't see it as, from what I see it, as an issue that is a problem. It's actually an issue where there is a mutual symbiosis which sort of lends itself to a lot of good work being done. In terms of the other issues that have been raised, in terms of rural development is a very important issue to us, and I think all of us have got a role as individuals and as corporates and as the BMF here. We've got a huge role to play. We're reorienting our focus in terms of CSI, in terms of where we source labor, and in terms of small and medium enterprises. We've got an entity called Anglo-Zimele that funds small and medium enterprises, which generate about 5,000 jobs across South Africa. Most of those entities are operating in rural areas. We believe there is more that must be done to close the rural-urban divide, and we will continue to look for people that we can work with in terms of making progress in that regard.
Mr. Sibiya?
May I just make from an outside the BMF leadership comment on the Chinese firstly. I think the consultation by the ministry was poor, and I think they should have consulted the black structures about that so that they defend it appropriately if they do, but also to give something away without getting anything, it is normally stupid. For us, we gave the right, and we don't have the right in Beijing or Shanghai or whatever. And so the ministry should have helped us to say, guys, we are going to give you this, but in terms of our engagement with China, you need to play a role in such a manner that the country benefits from China being the dragon, as it were, of the East and the world. And I think from the outside the BMF leadership perspective as well, around the divorce papers, I think we need to be saying there is no strong democracy which has no strong opposition. And therefore, in a sense, and before you categorize me, in a sense we need to be saying we need a strong opposition which is probably black. General Bandu Holomisa and I have engaged, he knows that he is not that. The IFP knows that it is not that. And I think the PAC knows it is not that. We need a very strong opposition to counterbalance the issue of the ANC. And some of us will be left in the ANC, and there are others who are free to go. And I wish, though, as well to say, as we do, the issue which is regrettable is timing and the nature. If people are living disgruntled, being angry as they are, it's a pity because they have lost the elections. However, the opposition being established with cooler heads and warm hearts, with no bad feelings and guile which we are experiencing, it is fine. And so people who want to go to the consultative conference, my view is let them go. It is going to be consultative. It is not going to coerce you to do anything. And for us, I think we need to ensure that our democracy continues to mature. And we encourage people to come and go, divorce and get remarried, or whatever.
We're now going to take the last two questions. We have the gentleman in the white shirt, and then just behind him, the gentleman in the striped shirt.
Thank you. My name is Oli from Botswana. I must thank the leadership of BMF for allowing me to come in there and observe here at my own cost. But what I need to say is that they need to be congratulated for what they are doing, and for us in Botswana, we are much encouraged by what you are doing here. And this is the country that shouldn't fail. And I tell you, if you fail here, the rest of Africa will go down. And I must say that that's what BMF is doing, is giving us the hope, that we can deal with these challenges. And we have challenges all over the place. Now, what I really wanted to say, and listen to the professor there, I got some inspiration. But what I didn't have to maybe help you with is how do you even start to talk to people, give people motivation when they're so hungry that I don't know how. Maybe should give me a hint on that. Then also dealing the second question, dealing with, I think transformation can only happen when we have willing partners. People are willing to actually transform. I have a problem and perception which I see is that it looks like there are some people who are willing to transform and there are people who don't want to transform. And therefore you have a situation where we're actually forcing this transformation. How do we actually deal with this situation where it looks like people don't want to transform?
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is George Baruleka. I'm from the Real Diamond City in Kimberley, from the BMF branch there. My issue is reaching out to the smaller and the younger kids in terms of inspiring them. And the question is, how do we create role models for them in terms of the successes that people get out of education? If I can give an example, when you have a good soccer player, the kid in Soweto or Ebuyan where I come from in Limpopo get to see that person and get inspired. Now, how do we actually get to know, or how does a child in a squatter camp get to know about baby Sibiya and what education has done for them, so that they can at least have a role model and have that appetite for education?
Right, Professor Marcus?
Do you mind if I stand up?
No, that's absolutely fine.
So I just talk better if I can try and see people. Well, I think I try and talk better. I'm never sure if I do. South Africa is a beacon of hope. I think that is true. And it's a beacon of hope to ourselves and the continent, but also to the world. Because South Africa is tackling problems that the world has been unable to resolve. So it's not easy. Nobody said it would be easy or fair. But it is a challenge, and it is a work that we have taken on over the generations. And the challenge for us is that under our watch, being all of us, we cannot allow this to fragment. So to me, the question of keeping a focus as to what is important and why, and that it is in the interest of the greater good, and we cannot lose sight of that, and I think we have to some degree. If we look at how do you motivate people when they're hungry, well, you know, I don't think that this ordinary South African's aspirations or demands are unreasonable. We keep hearing about these unrealistic or unreasonable expectations, but I don't see that they are unreasonable. What do people want? They want a roof over their heads, they want the dignity of work, they want to know the kids can go to school and be properly educated, they want to be able to provide health care. That is what people want. That is not unreasonable. It may take time to deliver it on the scale that you want to. And I think we have two challenges. The willing partners to transform, yes, absolutely. Those who are unwilling, let's put them aside. We've got the regulatory framework, we've got the legal compliance. Much more important in transformation is the willingness to transform. And I think the greater the interaction, the more willing people become. When they become involved, they have different experiences. We have to make those experiences and create them. And to me, the question of how do you motivate people, because they see it becomes possible. It doesn't have to be everything. Nobody's unreal. You know, South Africans are not unreasonable. They are not sort of demanding everything at one go. They want to know that progress is being made. They want to know change is happening. They want to know that it is going to happen for them as well. And that's why I do think it's possible to motivate. Because you motivate, and the question about hunger is very important. Because South Africa is perceived of as a poor country with a lot of rich people. We're actually the opposite. We are a rich country with an enormous number of poor people. And we don't necessarily utilize that appropriately because it's a mindset difference as well. So for me, how do you motivate when you're hungry? First of all, we need to improve the things that provide for people, your school meals, the question of how you support. All of those things are there because there's no reason for children to go to bed hungry today in our society. But the motivation is aspirational. people have to have a sense that it's possible to attain those goals. And that's what we need to do, every one of us. It relates to the second question of how do you create role models. Role models come from people who have succeeded. And unfortunately, I think we've only developed one kind of role model, which is success equals material value. And that is unfortunate because not everybody becomes a multi-billionaire. Success is how we live and how we treat others and the dignity and respect that we give. And I think our role modeling needs to look at all kinds of ways of building that. In particular, people like ourselves in this room need to do much more work with kids. And when I tell kids, I'm talking about kids in school from all ages, because we have enormous talent. And if that talent does not get an outlet, we have the frustration that sets in, and it's very difficult to turn that around. We need to do far more work ourselves, all of us, in relation both organizationally, individually, through the structures that exist. But in the end, the task is so big, it needs a government support and strategy and resource. And integrate far more, integrate sport into education, into a whole lot of other things that we do, and I think we can. I personally have no doubt, with the will that we have and the capacity and the thinking we have in this country, we can do this. It's not something that can't be done, but it does mean we've got to have focus, and it does mean we've got to build a trust between us, and not what we do also need to, finally I want to say, what we need to do is to recognize that we have a fallback position as South Africans. We are brilliant at being against something. Right? We can even march on ourselves and hand in our own petition. And we do it all the time. It's time for us to be for something and to have that ability. And that's how we will motivate people, because they see what you stand for in word and in deed, and it's not just money.
And ladies and gentlemen, on that very high note, we conclude the sub-theme number 2, economic transformation. Our panel, very quickly, once again, we had Professor Gill Marcus, who is, of course, she is the chairperson of the AFSA group. Then we had Mr. Bheki Sibiya, who is the executive chairman of SmartVest, also Mr. Kuseni Dlamini, head of Anglo-American South Africa, and the president of the BMF, Mr. Jimmy Manyi. And with that, if nothing else, I've delivered you on time for lunch. Thank you.